In today's video, I'm going to give you 8 camera settings that are going to take your wildlife photography to the next level. Hey everyone, welcome into Magnolia Photography SC. I'm Jeff House, and I'm a wildlife photographer in Charleston, South Carolina. So today I want to give you 8 camera settings that will really take your wildlife photography to the next level. And it's going to really be all about simplifying the process so we can become more creative with our images. We can focus more on our image capture as opposed to worrying about and panicking over camera settings. So that's going to be a big topic in today's video. And one thing that I also want to point out is it doesn't matter whether you're using a DSLR or a mirrorless camera for your wildlife photography. These settings will apply to both systems. However, there are a few extra or additional benefits that come with a mirrorless camera system, and we'll kind of talk about those as we go through the video. But the first setting that we're going to talk about today is image capture and the file format that you are using. Are you using JPEG or are you using the RAW file format? Yes, JPEG are much smaller images, much easier to capture a bunch of images on a memory card due to their small size, easier to store them when you get them off of your memory card. But the file format of JPEG, when it comes out of your camera, the camera strips so much data from the images when it comes out that you really limit your ability to edit your photos creatively. And that really doesn't lend to developing a style with your photos or having a lot of flexibility in manipulating your photos to fix things that might be issues as a result of the conditions we have to shoot with in wildlife photography. RAW file format is where you want to be. This is going to retain all of the data from the images, and it's going to give you tremendous power and control over your images in post-processing to really fix issues that are created, again, by the tough conditions that we have to face in wildlife photography. But it's also going to allow you to kind of form a style, an editing style, and a final image style that really resonates with you and is reflective of the art that you are looking to create. So that's setting number 1, is choose the RAW file format. The second setting that I want to talk about today is shooting modes. Now, there are various shooting modes, right? We have the P or program mode. This mode is essentially your camera's automatic mode. It will assess the brightness of the scene, and then it will choose a shutter speed and aperture for you. We then can use the A mode, that is the aperture priority mode, in which we choose the aperture, and the camera will then choose our shutter speed. And then we can use shutter speed priority, where we choose the shutter speed and our camera will choose the aperture. And lastly, we have manual, where the camera will do nothing for us. We have to set all of those settings. We have to control all of them in order to create our images. Here's the thing. We have 4. We're getting rid of 2 right off the rip. We're getting rid of program mode, and we're getting rid of aperture priority, because in both of those shooting modes, the camera is going to control our shutter speed. And we don't want the camera controlling our shutter speed at all, because it has no idea what we're shooting. And many of the times it's going to use the incorrect shutter speed. So we're getting rid of those. We're going to make it easy. We're getting rid of them. That brings us to shutter priority and manual. Now, manual is a great mode to go. And in most cases, I would recommend to you, learn manual. And I still would recommend that you learn manual mode, because ultimately it's just going to make you a better photographer, because it's going to help you to understand the image creation process much better. So yes, learn manual mode, but don't use it in your wildlife photography. Again, it comes back to what I was just talking about, right? You're going to be so focused on getting the correct settings that you're going to lose the whole art of image capture, and you're going and that part of your photography is really going to suffer. So we're getting rid of that to simplify the process. We're going to go with shutter priority, where we choose the shutter speed. We can use a slower shutter speed if the animal we're photographing is static. We can use a faster shutter speed if suddenly they start to move. It's going to give us great flexibility to ensure that we have very crisp and sharp photos. Now, that's setting number 2. Setting number 3 kind of goes hand in hand with choosing shutter speed as your shooting mode, and that is ISO. Right now, of course, ISO is just another setting that helps us to get a correct exposure. So if we're in very bright conditions, we can use lower ISOs to help us control exposure. If we're in very dark settings, we can increase our ISO to help us get a correct exposure. But of course, the one problem with ISO is that as we go higher and higher, our photos get noisier and grainier, right? Well, that's okay. That is okay, because what I would recommend when it comes to wildlife is just set your camera in auto ISO. Don't worry about it. Don't stress over it. We're going to be able to handle it later on in the post-production phase. There's another little tidbit or another little pro tip, if you will, that I want to give you though when it comes to ISO. It's not just the fact that we're raising our ISO that gives us noise in the photo. It's also tied to the amount of light. So let me give you an example. Let's, first of all, I hope you are doing this when you go out for your wildlife photography, but use a monopod, use a tripod, right? And you can kind of do this little experiment for yourself. Take some photos, and I want you to pick an ISO, doesn't matter, just a high ISO, 6400. Let's just say we set our camera to 6400 ISO, and we take one picture with a shutter speed of 1/250. And then we take another photo with a shutter speed of 1/2500. The 1/250 is going to be a much cleaner image because we're allowing more light into the camera. And adding more light into the camera is going to reduce the shadows in our images. Shadows are where grain and noise love to reside. So if we were to use that 1/2500 shutter speed, we're going to create more shadows in our images, and we're going to create more noise inside of those shadows. So that is the reason why the slower shutter speed allows for cleaner images. So if you're shooting static animals and we don't have to worry about having a fast shutter speed to freeze the action, make sure you're on that monopod, make sure you're on that tripod, use those slower shutter speeds, 1/500, 1/250. You may be able to go down to 1/100, depending on how still the animal is being. So those are the first 3 settings. What is setting number 4? The 4th setting that we're going to talk about is focus area. Focus area is going to be whether or not we're using a single point to focus or whether we're using an expanded point to focus. So instead of using one, you might go to an expanded focusing point that offers 9 points of focus. That is going to work much better, especially when we're tracking moving animals. So give yourself a little bit of margin for error by using that expanded focusing area. Number 5 is our drive mode. That's what is basically referring to when we take a picture, are we just going to take a single shot of that image, or are we going to have our camera set into what is referred to as a burst mode, where it's going to take multiple frames per second? Well, we're shooting wildlife. If you're shooting a static area, you can probably get away with a single shot, but I wouldn't recommend it. I would always recommend that you just put your camera into one of the burst modes, the higher frames per second. Usually you can choose from a low, medium, and high setting. I would just recommend putting it in high, another setting that you can just set it and forget it. So yes, when you push the shutter, it's going to click, 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 right? It's going to take a lot of photos, but that is really key when you're photographing wildlife, especially if the animal is moving. Number 6, should you use a mechanical or electronic shutter? Now, this really is a question for the folks that own a mirrorless camera, but you have essentially 2 options. You can use your standard mechanical shutter, which is just like any shutter on a camera. You're going to depress the shutter button and take pictures, and you're going to hear the shutter clicking, and you're going to take your photos. But there might be times, especially in wildlife, where you don't want to scare the hell out of the animals, right? So a nice option is to switch your camera into an electronic shutter mode. This is going to have your shutter run completely silent, super beneficial in certain situations. But what's the benefit using the electronic or mechanical shutter? Are there any other benefits just besides silence? Well, of course, if you're using the electronic shutter, you'll save a little wear and tear on the mechanical shutter. But overall, the mechanical shutter is going to produce a little bit of a sharper image. So that would be the disadvantage to going with the electronic shutter, right? You might lose a little bit of sharpness with your photos. But again, you're going to have to balance that out and figure out what's right for you depending on the situation. So as a general rule, I would say set your camera to a mechanical shutter. If you find yourself in a situation where you're concerned about disturbing an animal or scaring them, then simply set a hot button on your camera so that you can switch it very quickly to the electronic shutter mode. Tip number 7, back button focus. Now, you've probably never heard of this before, and you're probably very used to taking pictures by pointing your camera at something, depressing your shutter halfway down to lock your focus, and then fully depressing it to take the actual image. Well, we are going to remove the focusing part of taking a picture. We're going to take that completely away from the shutter button. Reason being is that, especially when you're shooting fast-moving objects like wildlife, it's so easy to depress that shutter halfway and then press it fully before you're prepared to do so and just fire off a bunch of random shots that are meaningless, right? We don't want that. It's very hard to focus on moving subjects that are moving very fast, very unexpectedly, right? And hold that shutter halfway down and track them at the same time. Very easy to get misfires in there. So we're going to eliminate that. And what we're going to do, and you're going to have to refer to your camera's manual, right? Your specific make and model, but you're going to program a button on the back of your camera. Usually there's a button on the back of your camera that says AF on. You're going to program the focusing part of taking a picture to this button. So when you're holding your camera up, your right thumb will press and hold that button, and then your index finger, like always, will be used to depress the shutter to take the pictures. Tracking moving subjects using this method, I'm telling you, it is life-altering, life-changing. You will thank me 1,000 times over if you've never heard, seen, or tried this tip before. Number 8 on camera settings, and this really isn't a camera setting. This is more or less tied into the fact that we have set our camera into shutter priority mode. We have set our ISO to auto ISO. That means we only have 2 settings to worry about when taking photos, okay? That is our shutter speed, which is why we just set it to shutter priority. And the second one is going to be exposure compensation. Now, exposure compensation is a dial that should be located on the top of your camera, right next to the shutter speed dial. And this is something that you can change. You can either decrease or increase the brightness of your image by turning it left and right. This is going to be very helpful when you're in those situations where you need a little bit more light. You can add some positive exposure compensation to your image. It will make the photo brighter, and then in turn, you can use faster shutter speeds. Conversely, if you're photographing, maybe your animal flies or moves from the shade to the sunlight, or maybe you're photographing a white bird, you can reduce the exposure compensation to get a better exposure on that bright or white animal, and so that you can get the detail in their feathers or in whatever is causing them to be bright, their fur, feathers, whatever it is, right? Exposure compensation is just a way to control the brightness of our image. But that's all we have to worry about with these 8 settings. We have to worry about shutter speed, and we have to worry about exposure compensation. Other than that, all we're worrying about is image creation. There you have it. Those 8 settings are the exact settings that you need to be using for your wildlife photography. I have a page on my website dedicated to these settings. I will leave a link in the show notes so that you can refer to it as needed. I'd love to know your thoughts, your comments, your suggestions. Leave them in the comment section below. And please feel free to subscribe to the channel if you thought this was useful and helpful. I appreciate you spending some time with me today, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Until then, take care.